Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid, and I'm here with my co-host, Grid contributing editor, Matthew Iglesias.
Hello.
Hey, Matt. So this week.
Yes, this week.
Bad take.
So this has been a week of, I think, a lot of discourse around the president's age, and he still has not formally announced a re-election campaign, and so on and so forth. And David Byler, who I think is a pretty smart election analyst, he said, "I don't get the quote, if Biden doesn't run, it's Kamala, and then Dems will lose thing." Because that's a reason, a concern a lot of people have is, well, if he were to step aside, Kamala Harris will be the nominee and she's a weak politician. So Byler says if there's a 2024 D primary, other people will run against her. And if she's as bad as everyone says, they'll nominate someone else. So this is a kind of a strong belief in primaries, right? That, if Biden steps aside and there's an open primary, then either it will turn out that people have underestimated Kamala Harris and she wins the nomination because she's got great political skills, or she'll lose to someone who's a better politician. But either way, anytime you have a contested primary, you're going to end up with a strong nominee. Michelle Goldberg did a column, and it struck me because I almost never disagree with Michelle Goldberg columns. But her piece, the thrust of the piece is that Biden is too old. And most of the paragraphs are about that. But she addresses this concern, and she says, well, some people say they want Biden to run again because they don't like Kamala Harris. But look, Democrats have a lot of great people on the bench. And she name checks Gretchen Whitmer and some others who I agree narrowly with what she said there, which is that it's not like Joe Biden is the only skilled politician in the Democratic Party. But I felt like she was yada-yadaing past the part where, through what mechanism does Gretchen Whitmer come to be the nominee in 2024? It would be a brutal primary contest, right?
I think this is the bad take, right? So we have these, we were discussing these two takes of which is the take we're going to talk about. And they boil down to this, which is, to me, so say if you're a Democrat right now and you would like to keep the White House in 2024, that's the premise here, is this kind of a take is saying the best course of action would be to have a competitive primary and come up with a different candidate than the current president. Yep. That's the argument. And as someone who's watched a lot of presidential campaigns and covered them and covered primaries, it seems to me that's a bad take.
Yeah, I mean, just looking back at the past few primaries that have occurred, right? In the 2020 cycle, Democrats, they had this field which very rapidly turned into this kind of race to the left, right, on policy terms, as candidates tried to outmaneuver each other by, a lot of them agreeing to some really wacky stuff, right? Saying, okay, I'm going to vow to eliminate private health insurance, to say I'm going to vow to legalize illegal border crossings. Biden, who eventually won, did less of that than other people in the field. But even Biden, right, he changed his position so that he wants to overturn the Hyde Amendment, which I sort of agree with that on the merits, but there has never been any point in time when that was even remotely close to happening legislatively. It hasn't occurred as a result of Joe Biden being president. It's not going to occur. He just shifted from a position he'd held his whole career to a new, less popular one. Similarly, he promised a moratorium on deportations, which once he became president, he wound up just not really doing because it's unpopular and unworkable. So that was the general dynamic. In the end, Democrats got, of the people in the field, the most moderate one, probably the most electable one of the people who could possibly have won the primary, but already to the point, you could have had someone with Joe Biden's kind of issue positions, but considerably younger, like Steve Bullock. But he just didn't have a realistic chance at winning because the fame of having been vice president of the United States is a really big advantage. And I think that sort of sets the table for what an open contest would look like. That
right.
Harris would have a big advantage because she's vice president, which is not to say she'd be unbeatable, but the way people would try to beat her is by going hard left. And you would end up with either Harris or a leftist or kind of what you had with the Hillary-Bernie primary, which was like you had the left-wing guy and then you had the more moderate person. But she kept like shifting left to try to block out Bernie in various things. And so you wound up with this like veteran politician who wasn't seen as like an inspiring change agent, but who also had in fact like adopted a lot of left-wing views. And it was cost a lot of money.
So here's where this take falls short for me when I was reading the Goldberg article, which was, sure, in theory, the purpose of a primary is you've got a field of Democrats or Republicans, whatever the case, vying for, the blessing of the party. Okay, so Democrats are saying this is the best candidate we think to beat, the other person, the other team. But in reality, one, that arguably does not always happen. Two, I think that when you were talking specifically about 2016, Hillary Clinton was at a point where she was toiling along to get the official count that she needed to win the primary, but there was no chance. I know everyone's going to, relitigate the primary here, but there was no chance that Bernie could win. This long spring of just Democrats beating each other up, specifically Bernie just hammering Hillary Clinton and her shifting positions and Democrats spending a lot of money and so fueling, I think, discontent inside of the party. And that does not, so even though arguably Hillary Clinton, maybe she was the best candidate and it worked out and she wins. But the process of getting there bloodied her. It angered the party. It sort of, cost a lot of money, like you're saying.
If Hillary had just been coronated, she would have been a stronger general election candidate, right? Like needing to go through the primary hurt her. But then secondarily, like the mere fact that she won the primary didn't change the fact that she was actually a relatively unpopular figure.
Sure.
Like there was no like magic, right? Like saying, okay, we're going to have an open primary didn't cause Amy Klobuchar to become the Democratic nominee because there's more dynamics than that. And Hillary had locked down the sort of party establishment lane. And so then there was an opening for a kind of anti-establishment gadfly. But there just wasn't an opportunity for somebody to be like, I'm really similar to Hillary Clinton in my policy positions, but just like a little bit more charismatic.
Sure. You're not going to, that's not what happens in primaries. And like you said, Hillary Clinton didn't come out on the other side of the primary with Democrats who previously, maybe didn't like her or support her going, wow, she endured the primary. I feel great. That's just not what tends to happen. I mean, it is true that parties line up behind their candidate in the end, but you just don't look at it and go, yeah, you would want, if given the choice between running a sitting U.S. president who, even the person making the case that there should be a primary thinks has a pretty strong record to run on versus opening up the entire field to a potentially bruising, 6 months or longer unnecessary campaign just doesn't seem like a good move.
I'm going to tee up like a fresh take here,
all right,
which is that something that I think is interesting about this is that the people making this case, right, they're taking for granted that what they want is for Biden to step aside. And then they're reassuring us that like the open primary is fine.
Yeah.
Right. But I think almost it would make more sense to say you want like Gretchen Whitmer could challenge Joe Biden.
Sure.
In the primary. She could say exactly all the things that Michelle Goldberg says in the column, that like, I really respect Biden. I think his administration has done great stuff. I just think we'd be better off with a younger person. For example, Gretchen Whitmer.
Sure.
Right. I don't think that would work.
Yeah.
Like, I think that would be just like obviously doomed to failure because being the incumbent president gives you significant advantages. But I do think that like logically, it would make a lot of sense. And it's even sort of true that needing to get out on the trail and like debate Gretchen Whitmer would demonstrate to like either Biden would do a good job and people would be like, I guess he's not too old. Or else you'd end up with Whitmer, right? If you imagine a scenario where Biden stands aside and then she has to run against Harris, I think that actually gets harder because you start to raise a lot of really sensitive identity issues, right? Like, are any of these people, is Pete Buttigieg going to cut a black woman in line to become the presidential nominee from an administration that they both served in? Like, that's really tough. Like, I don't see any universe in which that happens, which is not to say you can't run against her, you can't criticize her, but it would have to be an ideological criticism. You know, like AOC could run against Kamala Harris. She could say, like, I'm a democratic socialist and you aren't. I think it would be so challenging. I think like the media coverage of somebody saying, I don't have any like huge disagreements with Kamala Harris. I just think she's a little bit clumsy. Sure. So I should be president instead of her.
Yeah, it's not a great.
Like, it's going to be rough, even though, I mean, the reason this is like an issue in the discourse is that's what everybody thinks.
Yes. Well, also stepping back one smidge further, which is, okay, well, what do you run on? You say like, yeah, you should vote for me because Joe Biden did a good job as president, but also we don't think he should be president. So, but trust me, you should vote for the Democratic Party. You can't say your guy did a good job and also he's unfit to be president.
Sure.
What are you trying to say there to people? Just, oh, yeah, he's too old. Well, I don't know. So he wasn't too old in 2022 when he accomplished the things you're saying are good. But by 2023, he was too old. This isn't like, okay, Joe Biden, it was, he was president in 1990 and did great things. And it's like, you know what, man, he's too old now. This is last year he was fine. Next year, too old. I mean, that's where the other thing, the thing that's just kind of driving me nuts about this is, I think maybe Goldberg brought this up of he'll be in his 80s. It's like, yeah, add 4 to the number. And that's what happens. But in real time, what is the significant difference here that we're really talking about? And even she says he's a great president. The whole top of the piece is that she did this and I'm so happy with this and I like this. But, the issue is he's old. Okay, she feels that way, but what is the evidence? I mean, I think you can do a poll where, and I think there have been, but, would you prefer someone younger than Joe Biden? And Democratic voters say yes, that makes sense. But if you said to them, would you rather have a bitter, grueling primary that takes zillions of dollars and is really frustrating to watch and puts your party in a weaker position, or just like Joe Biden, we just give him some bran cereal and keep pushing him through for a few more years? Which would you prefer? And it's different questions. But I'm just not, in her piece, there was nothing in the piece that said to me, wow, this guy has to go. Like, there's a problem here, other than she thinks he's too old.
Well, I also think that people in our line of work, or really in like Michelle and mine's line of work, have a little bit of a credibility issue here, because the fact is, I mean, there was a really famous video of literally the New York Times editorial board, interviewing the presidential candidates and coming up with their recommendations, and none of them were for Biden. right? The only person at the New York Times editorial selection process who was for Biden was the security guard who worked in the elevator.
Yeah.
And that was the dynamic of the 2020 Democratic primary, right? So to an extent, if you're like, okay, people, a set of people, right, which is to say like college-educated, city-dwelling, left-wing political journalists don't think Biden should be the nominee in 2024. You are in the unique position of having written in the 2020 cycle that you thought he should be the nominee. And like, it would be a stronger, I don't want to say it would be a stronger piece, just like it would make more sense to hear from a Biden supporter that like, I like Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden's done good stuff, but now I think he's too old. If you're saying like, I didn't like Joe Biden, I didn't want him to be the nominee, but he won over my objections, then he got elected president. Then he actually surprised me by being a better president than I thought he would be. But now I don't think he should run again. And like, trust me, the next primary is going to be fine. You're like, there's like a lot of flips and contortions to that, right? And I think that you got to at least like open your heart to the possibility that it's just that like I don't love Joe Biden, but I like the fact that swing voters like Joe Biden and like I should just get on the bus.
Yeah. I mean, look, I wrote this piece back in the 2020 primary where I made the best case for Joe Biden. And I said, I think he's the strongest candidate to win the primary and then to go on and win a general election. All right. So at the time, the crux of the argument was he, if you looked at the midterms right before the 2020 election, there were a handful of Democrats they looked like they were going to take back House seats that were carried by Trump. And, there's these sort of tight races. And what those campaigns did is they only brought in like really popular apolitical figures to stump for them. So they sort of non-politicians like NBA players who everybody liked in the region, et cetera. The only politician, I talked to a couple of these campaigns, is the only politician they actually wanted to have come, and they actually, none of them would say on the record, like they asked other politicians not to come, but that was the implication, was they were turning down big name politicians from coming to stump for them. The only person that they wanted was Joe Biden, because they knew that he transcended political polarization in a way that was attractive to moderate voters. He has carried moderate voters in, kind of tough districts for Democrats in the past. And, that's who you were going to need for Democrats to win nationally, that you have to get moderate white people to vote for you. And Joe Biden is good at that, of getting white moderates to vote for him, including white men to vote for him. And, you might not like that as a progressive. You might think, well, I want a candidate who, is going to win by inspiring the youth to come out en masse. Well, that's nice, but, that doesn't happen. But what does happen is you can run a candidate who can win over lots of segments of people. And so that was kind of my case. And I think that nothing about that has changed.
Right. And I guess that's where I land on this, which is that, look, obviously an incumbent Democratic Party senator is not going to just like say on the record, like, I don't think Joe Biden should run again. But these guys do talk quietly on background. And I am waiting to hear from John Ossoff or Bob Casey Jr. or somebody on their staff or somebody who works for a frontline House member or somebody who works at House Majority PAC. If they start saying, hey, you know what? I think Biden is so old that we would actually be better off like rolling the dice with an open primary or going with Kamala Harris. Like, I would take that very seriously. But nobody on the front lines says either of those things. Like, none of them think that Harris would be a stronger nominee than Biden. And none of them think that a shake the Etch-a-Sketch, see what happens, like wild primary is particularly likely to land in a better spot. I mean, it's conceivable that it would, as with any of these things, but like it's not something anyone with skin in the game is looking for.
Well, the other, looking at the case for a candidate, even in hiring, one of the things I do is, past performance is one of the best predictors of future performance. And Joe Biden is the, last Democrat to win a presidential election. So if you're going to pick someone who you think could win a presidential election a few years later,
sure,
you might want to go with the guy who won a presidential election a few years ago. Just my take.
So I do want to say something on the merits here, which is that I think it's been a little hard to know whether I agree that Biden is, in some sense, like older than desirable. Because a critique that I have of the Biden White House is that I do think the portions have been too small, and that like we have not seen enough of Joe Biden, and that Joe Biden has not been. I mean, I think everybody is glad that it's not like Trump level, like volume and attention. But I think that Biden has allowed like the Democratic Party to be sort of defined by a nebulous blend of like loud voices on the internet and caricatures that appear on Fox News, rather than really being like fully present as like, I am the Biden administration. And it's given that he is quite old, it could be that one reason for that is his age. But it also could be that it was related to COVID protocols, or that it was related to the details of the legislative negotiating process for all these bills that got done. It could be that it was just a miscalculation on the part of somebody in the communications department, right? Something that I have noticed is that starting with the State of the Union address, actually starting a week before the State of the Union address, we started to see much more Biden than we had been seeing before. He did more aggressive media outreach in the lead up to the speech. He then did the speech where he ad-libbed, he really mixed it up with Republicans. He then immediately went out on the hustings, right, in a kind of classic Bill Clinton style. Like, there's no real reason for these press events to be occurring. He's just like, he's there in Michigan in a factory, right? He's like coming around doing stuff like that, mixing it up more. And I don't know, is that a deliberate effort to counter perceptions about his age? Is it just a reflection of the fact that now that Republicans own the House, it's like time for messing around, right? Like I could believe that they just had a philosophy that it was like, look, for our first 2 years, we have this narrow majority. So it's like shoulder to the grindstone, right? Like we're going to really focus on legislating. And now it's like, look, this is going to be 2 years of yelling at Kevin McCarthy, and we're going to see way more Joe Biden, in which case I'm going to look back and say, I'm sorry I was ever concerned about his age.
We've talked before about this. I mean, he signed a lot of bills, and you saw this in Obama years too, where as soon as Obama would step in kind of publicly on a bill, it made the bill less likely to pass.
Very counterproductive.
It was very counterproductive. And Biden is he's a creature of the Senate, as we've talked. He's somebody who grew up, came of age in the Senate, and he got his agenda done. And one of the things that was, I've seen it in Politico and reported other places, was that the White House was kind of grumpy that maybe he's not getting enough credit for the things that he's done. And to your point, well, he laid low to let the deals happen, and then he wasn't really out there selling them. So of course he's not going to get a lot of credit for it, but it's a catch-22 there. My opinion on this is also, okay, maybe he wasn't out there for a few years, but like the guy is objectively an older gentleman. Like put him in like a cryometric chamber, like just put him in like a gel bath for 2 years, just like, hey man, just relax, just relax, get like some skin treatments, like drink a lot of water, and then put him out there for 2 years. I mean, 2 years of Joe Biden running around. No one's going to be like, where was he those first 2 years? It's plenty of time to trot the guy around.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Why run 2 marathons? Just run the one,
Okay, wait. Let's take a break, though, because I do want to talk about the vice president. I mean, what's interesting is that the subtext to all of this is that there is this like really profound lack of confidence in Kamala Harris by leading Democratic Party people, right? Like that's what set all of this up, right? That none of these takes are, don't worry about it. Like we'll just put the VP in there,
yeah,
and she's going to sock it to him, which is striking to me because I remember when she was selected as vice president. And I appeared on a podcast, my podcast at the time, with my friend and current New York Times columnist Ezra Klein, and we were talking about Harris. And I was saying that I thought that this was a poor selection, that she was a clumsy, all the things that are now the conventional wisdom about Harris, and that, you know, could have done better. Ezra at the time was quite bullish on her.
Yeah.
And what I remember is that at the time, all these like leading top Democrats were really bullish on Harris. So it's not just that like leading people in the party are super down on her now, but they were super high on her when she was selected. And I think the evidence, if you look at the Biden VP search and how it went down, is that Biden was a little bit resistant to this pick, right? He kept sort of like getting other African-American women in the mix who didn't have like the right kind of political background, you know, so they were like vetting Susan Rice. He was trying to get some other people under consideration. But, you know, Harris was very well liked by party bigwigs. And Teddy Schleifer did a great piece for Vox at the time about how much Biden's fundraising in the primary was like shockingly bad for a former vice president. You know, it's not like he was like some hard scrabble outsider.
Sure.
But he was, I think, fourth in fundraising behind Bernie, Warren, and Pete.
Yeah.
Right? And Teddy did this great...
Actually, I didn't know that about Pete. That's wild.
Right.
That's wild.
So, like, Teddy did this great piece about how, like, the Harris selection had, like, really helped Biden with his donors and stuff.
She's coming out of California. She had the San Francisco, Silicon Valley connections.
And as somebody who was, like, never a big Kamala Harris fan or a proponent of this selection, I feel like all the people who were behind the selection in the first place have now like overcorrected and become like too hostile to her. And that like it's really not helpful to Kamala Harris, to the Democratic Party, or to like the United States of America to just write this person off as somehow like incapable of doing good politics. I just think she has to, I don't want to say like try harder, but just like back to basics, just like say popular stuff on the main issues of the day. Like it's not brain surgery, actually. She took some weird positions in the course of her primary campaign. Biden just had like better positions. She's now in the Biden administration.
Sure.
So she could just like vocally espouse all that stuff that people like. Every article you read about how she's like struggling to find her footing is like 70% just the exact shit that all vice presidents go through because it's a weird job. And then it's 30% like slightly odd stuff about how like she wants to be seen as a champion on specific issues, but it's like she'll probably be the nominee in 2028. Possibly she'll be the nominee in 2024. Possibly Biden will step. I mean, who knows? You're vice president. You have a good chance of becoming president. At that point, like you're the chief spokesperson on all the issues. It's like, it's not a big deal. You don't need a special issue. You just need to like be out in the cameras and, you know, do stuff people like from politicians.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I look at it and I think this is such, it feels like an episode of Veep, how sidelined she is. There was this, it was Biden had been, I forget if it was like a moment where he had been exposed to COVID or something like that. I forget the whole details. And there was this line in this article I read and it was the White House. The White House said, it was something to the effect of, don't worry, Kamala Harris, no, she's not in close contact. She's not a close contact with the president, like as in like close contact around a lot. I was like, man, burn, like she's not in the loop. I don't know, like what has she done that's so terrible? I mean, she's out there. Like I know what you're saying, and you could answer that, but it seems like she could go out there and talk about things that people like to hear about. She could give some speeches. She's a pretty good public speaker. I think part of the reason she was popular as a pick in, I want to say back, when she was getting the VP pick, is she's a very effective senator in hearings. As a lawyer, she's very good at walking through the case.
Show
right?
horse style
Yes,
senator.
She's very good. The limelight's on her, like high pressure situations, and she could really engage a hostile witness, and she was seen as just really good at it. Like, okay, here's this smart person who can walk us through the case, and I don't know what happened to that.
Well, and I just think that, you look at how do people become vice president, right? Which is always a different story. It's such a weird job. And everybody who is actually, while they are serving as vice president, it's always awkward because it's a weird job. But people become VP for different reasons, right? Al Gore became VP because he was so similar to Bill Clinton.
Sure.
Right. And they were trying to send a message about for real, this is baby boom white Southerners are the future of the Democratic Party, which is not true. But that was the message they were trying to send. Right.
Right.
Joe Biden, it was the opposite. Right. Like the whole point of Obama picking Biden was that Obama was so much fresh and new.
Yeah.
And then it was don't worry, guys.
We still got this guy.
We still got some just Catholic geezers. Right.
Yes.
Or that's still part of the Democratic coalition because Biden is Biden. Yes. And also a frequent VP thing, right? Like Dick Cheney, Mike Pence, to an extent Biden. The idea is that people like the outsider president idea.
Right.
But then they also worry a little bit. They're like, does this guy actually know what he's doing?
Sure.
And so you pick a lieutenant who's supposed to do what Biden did, which is
balance
go
the ticket,
down
right?
to the fucking Senate and schmooze with some guys.
Yeah. You're to make a different point.
So Biden didn't need that, right? He didn't need somebody to tell him how Washington works. He got Kamala Harris to reflect the diversity of the Democratic Party and of the country, and the fact that he's not just yesterday's man, but also to give himself some cover. Right? Substantively on issues, that this was 2020, it was the summer of George Floyd, it was defund police marches, and Biden was trying to not tip over the canoe on some of the stuff that was going on here and say that he still believes in law enforcement and crime control and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Harris is a good choice for that message. I mean, not just because she's an African-American woman, but because she was a district attorney. She was an attorney general of a state. She wrote her Smart on Crime book, which I think in 2019, people felt left her out of step with the times. But I think looking back on that book today from 2023, she was ahead of the curve.
Right.
And that's a good, that at a time when just people weren't paying a lot of attention to criminal justice issues, she was correctly threading the needle of we need to take these concerns about misconduct and racism seriously, but also insisting throughout the book that people being victimized by crime was a big problem and something that she worried about a lot. And that's what you would expect from someone who she was a line prosecutor.
I remember Joe Biden's speech. It was either, I can't remember if it was his acceptance speech or it was the final night before the election where he gave a speech. And he really explicitly talked about seeing himself as a bridge to the future. He was acknowledging explicitly that, yes, he is the past and he's this old white man, but that he's carrying the mantle of the Democratic Party as it is today. And look, he's setting up the Democratic Party for the future. He's picking this
younger than he is.
Younger than him, who could be a leader in the future. And he explicitly said it. And it was a way to say to the Democratic Party, I'm not taking us backwards, even though I might represent the past. I'm on board with the party is changing and moving, and I'm making this real gesture to prove that to you. To your point about Kamala Harris and her record as a prosecutor and record as Attorney General and as a thinker on crime, what's kind of funny in hindsight, not funny in hindsight, but it's she's actually now kind of more reflective of the current mood of the country than she was during the primary. I mean, if you remember during the Democratic primary, she was actually kind of apologetic in some ways for her record. She didn't stand there and say, you know what, look, yes, I was a prosecutor because I believe crime victims deserve justice. And I think that, and we need to thread a needle between, we need to hold police accountable and we need to get tough on crime, whatever her beliefs are. But that's not what she did. She kind of hid from it. Right. And then it kind of left her in this position. Well, why would I vote? Why are you running if it's not on your record? You know, it was a sort of weird thing. And I think, she could maybe be out there talking about that potentially. She does actually have right now, if she were running in a Democratic Party, she would really have something to differentiate herself if she wanted to. If this were a primary, she could talk about crime and her record and her past and point to her book and other things. But I don't know that she would, which is why you just sort of are left with, well, what has she been up to the last few years and how is she getting coverage, which can be fair or unfair.
I just think it's like all VPs struggle with that. I've heard some negative things about the staff dynamics and stuff in her office and whatever else. But I maintain hope because I do think that if you went back to basics and you're like, what are we going to do? What have other vice presidents done? Right. And it's always tricky, but it's you're the heir to the administration and its successes, right? Regardless of the specific facts. That's how Joe Biden played it. It is what it is. But then it's well, what is her political identity independent of Joe Biden? She was in the Senate for a very brief time. She wasn't the lead author of any major bills. But she did a good job. She has some good TV clips from that era. But the bulk of her career was as a prosecutor. She was a prosecutor much longer than she was a senator. She was a line prosecutor. She was a district attorney. She was an attorney general. She took some brickbats from the left for being too tough on crime at a time when that was kind of fashionable. But the worm has turned and the wheel of history has come around to the positions that Kamala Harris held all along. And as a Black woman, she is credible in saying she has these positions because she's concerned about the safety of communities, not because she's indifferent to racism. She's also half Asian as well as half Black and in a position to talk about, some of the challenges and nuances that have happened around educational issues in those kind of communities. And if you just step back and look at the fundamentals, that the course of action for her is pretty obvious, actually. It was really poor timing for her, for somebody whose whole career had been as a slightly reformist prosecutor, to be running in the year 2019, 2020 was the maximum moment when people were oh no, that's bad. But at any time earlier in history, people were no, that's a good resume for a politician, which is why it's the resume she put together. And now looking forward, it's still a good resume for a politician. Longtime former prosecutor, right? Somebody who ran in a very blue jurisdiction, but she ran to the right of the incumbent DA and beat him. That's good. That's good stuff. Just be that person who was actually the majority of her political career. And you got to tour the country a little bit and accept that being vice president is inherently odd.
You've got these people with their takes who, they were wrong in 2020 about Joe Biden, but they were right about Harris. I don't know what lessons people should learn here, but I do want to talk about resumes. I think it's true what you're saying, that she has a strong resume, but we've been talking a lot about the advantages of being an empty suit, and being inexperienced and age. Nikki Haley, the Don Lemon stuff from last week is just rich to me. Oh, she's past her prime. She's 51. And there's sort of a brouhaha about this. And look,
I'm not giving any Don Lemon takes.
Nikki Haley brought it on herself in a way. She was saying Biden, she's nodding to Biden being too old and Trump being too old. And she's saying, I'm a new generation. I'm young. Yeah, Don Lemon unholstered that take of, well, maybe she's past her prime. Who is she to be calling out anybody? And it was oh, God, that's wild. You really just don't want to.
I do think it's true, though, that for strictly optimal terms, the best thing to do is to find the youngest, most inexperienced person you can slightly credibly put up there. You know, like you can't just run a 19-year-old who hasn't done anything.
Sure.
But, you know, as much like recently we've had a bunch of older presidents and a lot of like, oh, is this guy too old kind of thing.
Yeah.
But prior to that.
I mean, I remember Barack Obama, there was a little flavor of, is he too young?
Well, and there's a long tradition of that, right?
Yeah.
Of Obama is too young. Jimmy Carter has no experience. JFK is too young. And it's not just that like Biden and Trump to an extent proved the haters wrong by being old, but the people who were thought to be too young were like some of the most dominant politicians of their eras, because the sad reality is that you're in politics for a year. You got to make 100 decisions.
Sure.
If 98 of those 100 decisions are correct, like objectively, we all understand, like 98% is a good score on a test.
Sure.
Right? It is hard to be perfect all the time.
Yeah.
But the voters and the press are like insane. And if you make 98% of your decisions correct year after year for 20 years, what that means is 40 bad decisions. And people will just give you shit about those 40 bad decisions all day, every day. And like nobody cares.
You remember the subcommittee vote he took it was like in the 70s? It was his first year. It was his first year in the Senate, and there was a subcommittee thing on abortion, and he voted yes in subcommittee, but no on the general vote. And I was like, man, who knew? I didn't know this about, Biden and abortion, and it's like grainy photocopies of the bill and stuff. And that, even I was like very caught up. It's like, what does he really believe? There's just a lot.
Genuinely, like nobody is perfect, right? Like the more time, and nobody gets credit for having been right. You know what I mean? Nobody is like, wow, what an amazing job he did on the Foreign Affairs Committee in 1986.
That subcommittee.
Talking about military aid to the Contras.
I can't point to any other subcommittee votes the man has ever taken.
You can see it even now, right? It's like every month that passes, I feel like Pete Buttigieg's presidential aspirations get tougher. And it's just because like more stuff keeps happening.
Trains are going off the rails.
Right, it's like
balloons are flying around.
He didn't crash the train, but it's like you find anything that happens is just downside, right?
And
you will never be better than when you were the mayor of a random town in Indiana that nobody's heard of.
Yeah. I mean, I think is like, oh man, what a genius move. He's going to be Department of Transportation. Nothing's going to happen. He's just going to, tell people wear their seatbelts and not look at their phones while driving, and then all of a sudden, I don't know about these balloons that are flying around, and like this trash. Who knew there was trash flying around in the air?
Yeah,
it's not good.
Pete
for him.
did sky trash.
Pete brought a sky trash and just trains derailing. It's unfortunate for him, but
this is why like everyone, me, you, Michelle Goldberg, everyone in the world like name checks Gretchen Whitmer because like all we really know about her is that she's like won some elections in a swing state. And like nobody actually cares about the details of Michigan public policy. Like she's pro-choice and like that's great. But that's the classic, just like popular swing state governor who like maybe did two things that you can put in bullet points. Like that's like aces politics, right? Like the more you serve, and we're going to see eventually, this will be take for another time, but it's like we're going to see as like Ron DeSantis gets closer to the White House, that like having served multiple terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, where you have to take recorded votes on whatever crackpot shit your colleagues come up with, it's going to be really toxic. If he was just the character he plays in Tallahassee, he'd be in way better shape. But like you're votes. In Congress, you're voting to privatize Medicare. He tried to eliminate libraries.
Yeah, he's voting for stuff. And he did that. What was that weird LSAT thing you sent me? He was like scamming people with the LSAT. I don't know. Who does? Was that DeSantis? I don't know. I watched it. It was
Before
weird.
he was in politics, he was selling LSAT prep courses.
LSAT freedom or something. It was amazing. Anyway, the point being, the House is one of the worst places to be. You just take too many.
All they do is vote.
They just take votes that are really bad for them. Well, I don't know if age is going to matter in this one. Who knows? Who is to say? But clearly, Republicans are talking old. Democrats are talking about people being old. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, youngest governor in the country at the moment, she did the response to the State of the Union, and she opened up with, "I'm so young, and I am the future," whatever. And she was criticizing, she was calling Joe Biden old, but I thought it was a kind of, subtweet there of Donald Trump, who she worked for. She's young. She and I are the same age, so she's quite young. She's energetic. Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
I don't know, but except, I mean, I'm 41, I think. It really annoys me that we now have elected officials who are younger than I am. I get upset when I meet them.
I know. Anyway, I won't go. My only tangent on this is I had a dream that I was actually 39 and I'd been telling people I was 40 and I was like, oh my God, I gotta undo it. I had just messed up. I'm like, I'm 39, everybody. I'm not, I'm 40. It's fine. Okay. I think we've agreed here, right? That everybody's takes are bad on this. Like maybe Kamala wouldn't be that bad, but that's beside the point because the underlying take of Joe Biden shouldn't run might be bad anyway.
It doesn't seem that good. Harris, I mean, who knows? She might raise her game, but she also might not. Open primary is tough, man.
You don't know what's going to happen.
It's a tough look. Now, if we could bring back the smoke-filled rooms.
Yeah, that's what we need. You know, that's what I believe at the end of the day.
I think we could do better than any of these people.
Yeah, I know. But we already talked about you quit smoking. That's over. It would just be, I don't know what would be in the room.
No, you want to get like a panel of 12 security guards who are all heavy smokers.
They will tell you.
They're in touch with real America.
Honestly, let's just ask them who they think, and they'd pick the right president, clearly. All right.
Okay, this has been another episode of Bad Takes from Grid. We are produced, as usual, by District Productive, and we'll be back next week with more Bad Takes.